It's the year 1250. Tonight you're sleeping in a single dark room beside your parents, your children, a coughing stranger passing through town, and possibly a goat tied near the fire. The air is thick with smoke. The floor beneath you is damp with old straw, spilled ale, grease, mud, and animal waste. Someone nearby is snoring loud enough to shake the walls. Someone else is grinding their teeth in their sleep. And despite how horrifying this sounds to us now, medieval people considered this completely normal. In fact, being alone for long periods of time in the Middle Ages was often associated with danger, sickness, punishment, or death. Today, modern Americans will destroy an Uber driver's rating just for attempting small talk. Medieval families spent their entire lives pressed against other human beings, eating together, sleeping together, arguing together, surviving winters together. Privacy wasn't a right. It barely existed as an idea. And the strangest part is, many historians believe these filthy, overcrowded households may have created stronger emotional bonds than modern life does today. Because medieval homes were not really homes in the modern sense. They were survival machines. Smoke poisoning was treated like an acceptable trade-off, because the smoke also preserved the roof and killed parasites. Doctors genuinely believed bathing too often could make you dangerously sick. Entire families shared beds not because they wanted intimacy, but because freezing to death alone was a very real possibility. And once you understand how medieval people actually lived, how they slept, washed, ate, and endured constant human contact, modern life starts to look strangely artificial by comparison. And if you enjoy exploring strange historical realities that sound completely fabricated, but are disturbingly factual, hit like and subscribe, because the deeper we dig into medieval life, the more bizarre it becomes. So here's the question. If the average modern person were dropped into a real medieval house in 1250, would they adapt to the filth and closeness? Or would the modern human mind completely collapse within the first 48 hours? Let's find out. Most people today think of a house as a place built for comfort, warm beds, privacy, soft lighting. A medieval peasant in 1250 would have found that idea almost ridiculous. Because medieval homes were not designed for comfort, they were designed for survival. Most ordinary families in England lived inside small one-room timber houses built using wattle and daub, a woven skeleton of wooden branches packed tightly with mud, straw, clay, and animal dung. Which means many medieval homes were literally sealed together with manure, not exactly the charming countryside cottage people imagine today. During winter, freezing air slipped through cracks in the walls. Rain softened parts of the structure into damp sludge. Roofs leaked. Floors turned wet and uneven beneath layers of dirty straw. But medieval builders were not trying to create luxury. They were trying to create something that could survive cold, moisture, and decay long enough to keep a family alive through winter. And once you stepped inside, the house felt less like a home and more like a living organism. The smell hit first. Smoke, wet earth, animal heat, damp straw, old grease soaked deep into wood after years of cooking over an open fire. Above your head, the ceiling beams were coated in layers of soot so thick they formed a black, glistening crust across the rafters. Orange firelight flickered endlessly against the walls while grey smoke drifted through the room, clinging to clothes, blankets, hair, even skin. And the smoke never fully disappeared. A modern person would probably panic and throw open every window. Medieval people did the opposite. They kept the central hearth burning almost constantly, even inside cramped houses with terrible ventilation. At first, this sounds unbelievably unhealthy. The smoke corroded the lungs, blinded the eyes, and guaranteed years of chronic respiratory misery for people breathing it in every day of their lives. But here's the strange paradox. The smoke was also helping the house survive. Heat from the fire dried moisture trapped in the roof before rot could spread through the timber. Smoke helped preserve wooden beams from insects and mold. It discouraged fleas, lice, and parasites from multiplying too aggressively inside crowded sleeping spaces. In some ways, the smoke acted like a primitive disinfectant inside a packed biological ecosystem of humans and animals living under one roof. So yes, the smoke was slowly poisoning everyone, but without it, the house itself might literally rot apart, and humans were rarely the only creatures living there. Chickens wandered across the floor, dogs slept beside the fire. During harsh winters, goats or pigs were sometimes brought indoors because losing livestock could destroy a family financially. Human space and animal space blended together into one cramped environment, filled with noise, heat, moisture, fleas, smoke, and constantly recycled air. Which also meant that when night finally came, the house transformed into an entirely different kind of battleground. Because sleeping in medieval England was rarely private and almost never comfortable. When night fell in medieval England, the house did not become peaceful. It became crowded. The fire in the hearth faded into glowing embers, while cold winds slipped through cracks in the walls and roof. Shadows stretched across smoke-blackened rafters. A dog curled near the fire. Chickens rustled softly in the corner. One by one, entire families lowered themselves onto rough straw mattresses called palliaces, spread directly across rush-covered floors. There were no private bedrooms for most people. Parents, children, grandparents, servants, sometimes even travellers, slept side by side inside the same cramped room, packed tightly around the last remaining warmth of the fire. During winter, that closeness could mean survival. Modern people think of sleep as personal space. Medieval people thought of it as heat management. Blankets were expensive, firewood was limited, houses leaked freezing air constantly. Human body heat became one of the most reliable ways to stay alive through cold nights. Families shared blankets not because it felt cozy, but because sleeping alone near a drafty wall could become dangerously cold before morning. Warmth was survival. Privacy was a luxury. Crowded sleeping also came with its own strange social rules. Older relatives and small children were often placed closest to the hearth. Guests usually slept near the outer edges of the room. In tighter homes, people sometimes slept partially upright against wooden chests or walls simply because there was nowhere else to go. Then came the blanket problem. If one person rolled over and stole too much fabric during the night, everyone noticed immediately. A single blanket slipping away could expose someone else to freezing air within seconds. Diplomacy became very important very quickly. Snoring, coughing, grinding teeth, crying children. Medieval people spent their entire lives surrounded by the sounds of other human beings sleeping nearby. Silence itself would have felt strange. Perhaps the most uncomfortable detail for modern audiences is this: sharing sleeping space with strangers was often considered normal. Hospitality customs encouraged families to shelter travellers, especially during bad weather. That sometimes meant sleeping beside people you'd only met hours earlier. Today, many people feel uncomfortable if a stranger sits too close on a bus. Medieval society treated shared sleeping space as an unavoidable part of survival. Of course, living this closely created serious problems. Fleas spread easily through straw bedding. Smoke lingered low through the room all night. Illness moved rapidly through overcrowded households where everyone breathed the same stale air. Yet medieval people accepted these conditions as ordinary life. Because if surviving the night together was difficult, keeping the house itself clean was even worse. Modern people often imagine medieval Europe as a world where nobody washed, everybody smelled terrible, and basic hygiene simply did not exist. But the reality was more complicated, and in some ways, far more logical than most people realise. Medieval people absolutely cared about cleanliness. They just did not trust water the way we do. By the 13th century, many Europeans believed the human body became vulnerable after bathing, especially in hot water. According to medieval medical theory, warm baths opened the pores and allowed disease to slip into the body through the skin itself. In a world constantly surrounded by illness, avoiding frequent full-body bathing was not considered dirty. It was considered cautious, which sounds absurd today. Until you remember, medieval people had no idea germs existed. Instead of daily hot showers, cleanliness focused on smaller rituals woven naturally into everyday life. People regularly washed their hands and faces using bowls of cold water kept inside the household. Wealthier families sometimes added herbs like rosemary or lavender to improve the smell. Hair was carefully combed using fine bone or wooden combs designed not only for grooming, but also for removing lice and fleas hiding near the scalp. And yes, lice were incredibly common. Inside crowded medieval homes filled with shared bedding, animals, smoke and stale air, parasites spread easily. Grooming each other became a normal domestic routine. Family members sat near windows or firelight carefully picking through hair, while tiny combs scraped softly against the scalp. Romantic medieval paintings usually leave that part out. Clothing mattered just as much as skin. Linen undergarments were especially important because medieval people treated linen almost like portable cleanliness. Unlike heavy wool outer clothing that trapped sweat and smoke for weeks, linen layers could be washed more often and helped absorb oils away from the body. In many households, changing into fresh linen was considered more important than taking a full bath. Soap also existed, although most modern people would probably regret trying it immediately. Medieval soap was rough, harsh, and commonly made from animal fat mixed with alkaline substances like wood ash. It worked reasonably well on fabric. Human skin was another matter entirely. So no, medieval people were not casually wandering around covered in filth without caring. They may not have showered every morning, but neither did they want to smell like a goat at Sunday Mass, and smell mattered socially. Churches, markets, festivals, and noble courts all created pressure to appear reasonably clean and respectable. Medieval society absolutely had standards of hygiene. They were simply shaped by different medical beliefs and harsher living conditions. Of course, no amount of combing, linen washing, or cold water cleaning could fully solve the deeper problem hiding inside medieval homes, because the floors themselves had become layers of permanent filth. By modern standards, the average medieval floor would probably be considered a biohazard. Most homes in 13th century England did not have wooden floorboards or stone tiles. Ordinary people lived on compacted dirt floors covered with layers of rushes, bundles of reeds, straw and dried plants scattered across the ground to absorb moisture and soften the surface underfoot. At first, fresh rushes probably smelled earthy and pleasant enough. The problem was what happened afterward. Day after day, the floor absorbed spilled ale, soup grease, mud dragged in from outside, scraps of meat, animal urine, smoke residue, and whatever else landed there during daily life. Dogs slept on it. Chickens wandered across it, pecking at crumbs. Wet boots crushed dirt deep into the layers below. Over time, the rushes slowly darkened into a damp, rotting carpet of organic waste. And medieval families usually did not remove all of it. They often solved the problem by scattering fresh rushes directly on top of the old ones, which meant some household floors became layered with months, occasionally even years, of compressed filth underneath. Medieval writers occasionally complained about floors hiding rotten food, mould, spit, and animal droppings buried beneath newer layers of reeds. Walking across the room sometimes released trapped smells back into the air like disturbing a compost pile, and somehow, people still ate and slept there. That is the psychological detail modern audiences struggle with most. How do human beings comfortably exist inside conditions that sound unbearable to us now? Part of the answer is simple. Medieval people experienced smell differently because they lived inside these environments constantly. The human brain adapts surprisingly fast to repeated sensory conditions. A modern person entering a medieval home would probably recoil instantly from the mixture of smoke, damp straw, sweat, wet animal fur, stale beer, and rotting organic matter trapped inside the floor itself. Medieval families barely noticed it anymore. After enough years, the smell stopped registering as filth. It simply became the atmospheric baseline of daily existence. That does not mean medieval people enjoyed dirt. Many households still swept floors, replaced rushes periodically, and tried to maintain some level of order. Wealthier homes sometimes scattered fragrant herbs like lavender, mint, or fennel into fresh rushes to soften the smell indoors. But there were limits to what cleaning could realistically accomplish inside overcrowded homes shared with animals, smoke, moisture, and limited ventilation, especially during winter. Cold weather trapped people indoors for longer periods. Mud accumulated faster. Floors stayed damp for days. Animals were sometimes brought inside to prevent financial disaster during freezing nights. Every extra body added more moisture, more smells, and more waste into the same enclosed space. The medieval house was not divided neatly into clean and dirty areas. Everything blended together. Cooking, sleeping, eating, sickness, animals, and waste all compressed into one struggling ecosystem trying to survive another winter. And despite conditions like these, medieval households were still expected to shelter strangers when necessary, which meant sometimes the person sharing your crowded, filthy floor at night was someone you had only met a few hours earlier. Picture a freezing winter night in medieval England. Rain rattles weakly against the roof while icy air leaks through gaps in the timber walls. Inside, the hearth burns low to conserve firewood. The family is already crowded together beneath shared blankets when suddenly, a knock echoes through the door. Not a friendly knock, a desperate one. Outside stands a traveller soaked with mud, shivering in the darkness, asking for shelter before the cold becomes fatal. Modern instincts immediately raise every possible alarm. Do not open the door, do not trust strangers, definitely do not invite an unknown man into the room where your entire family is sleeping. Medieval people understood those dangers too. Travel during the Middle Ages was risky. Roads were dangerous. Banditry existed. Strangers could absolutely carry disease, violence, or trouble into a household. Fear of outsiders was very real. But so was Christian duty. Throughout medieval Europe, hospitality was treated as both a moral obligation and a religious expectation. Offering shelter to travellers, especially during dangerous weather, was considered an act of charity closely tied to Christian values. Refusing someone protection on a freezing night could be viewed as cruel, sinful, or socially dishonourable. So families often opened the door anyway. And once inside, the traveller did not receive a private guest room with fresh towels and complimentary soap. Most households barely had enough sleeping space for themselves. Guests usually slept directly inside the same crowded room as everyone else. In poorer homes, that sometimes meant sharing the same mattress, blanket, or patch of floor with people they had only met hours earlier. Imagine introducing yourself to someone for the first time and immediately negotiating blanket territory beside them for the night. From a modern perspective, this feels psychologically impossible. Today, privacy defines personal safety. Medieval society operated differently. Identity came less from individuality and more from belonging to a household, village, or religious community. People lived in constant proximity to others from birth onward. Personal boundaries existed, but they were far less rigid than modern expectations. Survival depended on cooperation. A traveller seeking shelter tonight might become the same person offering protection to your relatives somewhere else along the road months later. Hospitality created informal networks of survival across medieval society. Refusing aid too aggressively could damage reputations within small communities where trust mattered deeply. Of course, this system created tension inside the household itself. Every extra person brought more noise, more smells, more moisture, and more risk into an already overcrowded home. A coughing stranger sleeping beside your children was not exactly reassuring during an age where illness spread easily and medical knowledge remained limited. Yet medieval families constantly balanced fear against obligation. That balancing act reveals something modern audiences often forget. Medieval life revolved around collective endurance rather than personal comfort. People survived not because conditions were safe or hygienic, but because communities accepted levels of closeness that would make many modern people deeply uncomfortable. Ironically, even wealth could not fully buy privacy in the medieval world, because the richer you became, the more people watched you sleep. At first glance, noble life in medieval England seems infinitely better than peasant survival. Stone castles, thick walls, feather mattresses, private chambers, expensive blankets imported from abroad. Compared to sleeping beside chickens on a dirt floor, aristocratic life looks almost luxurious. And to be fair, it was. Many wealthy families slept in upper rooms called solas, elevated chambers separated from the noisy public areas below. These spaces often contained proper wooden beds, fur coverings, shutters against winter drafts, and mattresses stuffed with feathers instead of mouldy straw. For medieval standards, this was extraordinary comfort. But privacy, that part barely existed. A noble's chamber was not a sealed personal sanctuary the way modern bedrooms are. It functioned more like a controlled social space constantly flowing with servants, attendants, guards, messengers, and household staff. Fires needed maintenance. Candles required replacement. Food arrived throughout the day. Clothing had to be prepared. Water basins carried in and out. Beds arranged. Chamber pots emptied. Solitude was an impossible luxury. Even at night, the noble chamber remained occupied, with bodyguards and trusted attendants sleeping directly on the floorboards or against the doors, because wealth attracted danger. Poisoning, assassination, theft, political betrayal. Powerful people in the medieval world rarely enjoyed the safety of isolation. Privacy itself could become suspicious. Kings especially lived under near-permanent observation by servants, advisors, guards, and visiting nobles. Important meals were watched, conversations overheard, sleeping quarters monitored carefully. The richer you were, the more people watched you sleep. This total exposure routinely shocks modern audiences, accustomed as we are to equating wealth with isolation. Medieval aristocracy worked differently. Status meant visibility. A noble household operated almost like a living theatre, where power had to remain constantly visible to everyone around it. Even sleep reflected hierarchy. The finest beds were elevated above the floor to separate nobles from dirt, insects, and cold draughts. Curtains around the bed provided limited warmth and symbolic privacy, but rarely true isolation. People still entered the room freely. Conversations continued nearby. Servants moved constantly through the chamber while the household functioned around them. In many castles, silence barely existed. And despite all the luxury, medieval nobles still shared one uncomfortable reality with peasants below. Life remained intensely communal. The scale changed. The fabrics improved. The smoke smelled slightly better. But human closeness remained unavoidable across every level of society. That may be the strangest contrast of all. Modern people often dream about escaping others, buying larger homes, locking doors, building distance. Medieval society moved in the opposite direction. Identity came from constant interaction with households, servants, relatives, guests, and communities. Solitude was rare not only because homes were crowded, but because medieval culture itself was deeply collective. From birth to death, people lived inside each other's lives, and that constant closeness shaped the medieval mind in ways modern society barely remembers anymore. By almost every modern standard, medieval domestic life looked miserable. The houses were overcrowded, the air was thick with smoke, floors absorbed years of grease, mud, and waste. Entire families slept packed together beside dying fires, while animals wandered through the same room. Illness spread easily. Silence barely existed. Most modern people would probably last one night before desperately searching for an exit. And yet, medieval life contained something modern society increasingly struggles to maintain: constant human presence. People rarely faced the world alone. Someone was almost always nearby. Family members, servants, neighbours, travellers, children, animals, clergy. Meals were shared, labour was shared, grief was shared. Even suffering itself became communal. That closeness created tension, exhaustion, and conflict. But it also created a kind of social permanence modern life often lacks. Today, millions of people sleep inside clean, climate-controlled homes while experiencing levels of loneliness. Medieval communities might have considered emotionally catastrophic. We have private bedrooms, soundproof walls, locked doors, and endless ways to isolate ourselves from one another. Modern comfort solved many physical hardships. It did not solve human isolation, and perhaps that is the strangest historical trade-off of all. Over centuries, Western society slowly transformed privacy into a form of personal freedom. The ability to close a door, sleep alone, think alone, and exist without constant observation became associated with dignity and independence. But every gain creates a loss somewhere else. Medieval people endured overcrowding because survival demanded interdependence. Modern people achieved unprecedented privacy by reducing that dependence. In many ways, both systems created different forms of suffering. The medieval world collapsed under the weight of overcrowding. The modern world is quietly suffocating under the weight of isolation. Today, we sleep behind locked doors, with soundproof walls and private bedrooms. Medieval people had none of that. The question is, are we actually more comfortable now, or just more alone? Before you go, leave a comment telling us what part of medieval life you want to explore next, because your ideas help this community uncover even more strange, uncomfortable and fascinating truths about the medieval world. And if you enjoyed exploring the strange realities of medieval life, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because this is only the beginning. There are still countless bizarre, uncomfortable and surprisingly human details from the Middle Ages waiting to be uncovered.